Test. Good. Do it again. Hello. Test. Test. Good. Okay. We're going to get started. I want to say hello and welcome to Pathway to Peers 2024. My name is Stephanie Frizzell. I'm an after stroke coordinator with March of Dimes Canada. We have some amazing presentations set up for you today, as well as our lived experience panel this afternoon. Some of you may have had time to visit our community booths already, and we have some time this afternoon as well during our nutrition break for you to visit any booths that you might have missed. Please make sure to bring your completed passport to the registration table by 3:30 to be entered into the draw for our iPad. Before we keep going, I just want to say a quick thank you to our sponsors, Sick Kids Foundation and Valiant Legal Injury Lawyers. And I do want to do our land acknowledgement today. I want to acknowledge that we are on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I also recognize that there might be other people joining today from across the country. The Mi'kmaq people cared for our lands, the sandy seashores, the lush forests, the pristine lakes long before today. We honor and respect them and pledge to share in the responsibility to care for this land for future generations. I want to take a moment to read a few verses written by Rita Joe, a Mi'kmaq girl who was orphaned at the age of 10 and sent to a school where she wasn't allowed to speak her language. She wrote, "I lost my talk, the talk you took away, when I was a little girl at Shubenacadie School. You snatched it away. I speak like you, I think like you, I create like you, the scrambled ballad about my word. So I gently offer my hand and ask, let me find my talk so I can teach you about me." In 1978, her first book, The Poems of Rita Joe, was published. Over her lifetime, she published 6 other books, was made a member of the Order of Canada, and was called to the Queen's Privy Council for Canada. And in 2023, Nova Scotia's Heritage Day was held in her honor. In the spirit of Rita Joe, I pledge to take the offered hand, to learn, and to be a staunch ally in reconciliation. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Michelle Plowman. Dr. Plowman is a neuroscientist and a physiotherapy researcher focusing on creating novel and potentially powerful rehabilitation interventions that not only restore function, but also promote brain plasticity. She defies conventional thinking by combining interventions such as aerobic exercises and cognitive training to create recovery synergies in stroke and MS. She launched Newfoundland and Labrador's first rehabilitation research program, opening her laboratory, the Recovery and Performance Laboratory, in 2014. Dr. Plowman's focus on restorative approaches these debilitating neurological disorders has a profound effect on patients, families, and communities. And I'll pass it over to you.
Hi, welcome everybody who are here in person. And also, I know there's a large group online who are listening in. And I thought I might start with, I'm from St. John's, Newfoundland, but I did do my physiotherapy training here in Halifax at Dalhousie University and thoroughly enjoyed that. And from that moment of working with people who had neurological injury, I knew that it was my calling. I had absolutely no doubts in my mind. And so I worked for about 15 years. So in clinical practice, so I worked in a rehabilitation unit called the Miller Center, which is in St. John's, and some other hospitals around St. John's. I focused a lot on traumatic brain injury, spinal cord injury, stroke, people who had tumors removed from their brains, and then more recently, multiple sclerosis. And I became involved in multiple sclerosis because I was in my 20s, and my classmates and people I knew were getting multiple sclerosis, and there really wasn't much treatment available for people. So I went back to graduate school and I worked in animal models of stroke. So what does that mean? It means that we create a brain damage in an animal model, which is a rat. The thing about a rat, it's pretty smart. And you can teach a rat to reach for pellets so that when I create damage in the brain, I can look and see how that forepaw is moving and how the animal thinks and scans its environment, because we all know it's very hard to catch a rat because sometimes they're smarter than us. They can navigate and solve problems in an amazing way. So we can utilize this and understand about stroke recovery. And it's there that I learned the fundamentals of neuroplasticity. So that's what I'm going to tell you about today. I've also given you my email. I get calls and emails all the time. Feel free, drop me a note. If you have a question, I'll always answer. So what is it we're going to try to do today? First, everyone talks about this word neuroplasticity, but really the word is fairly new. When I was in university learning this, we didn't use this word. We were thinking about it in terms of how the brain modified itself, but it's a relatively new word. So people use the word and don't necessarily understand exactly what it means. So I'm going to give you like my mini lecture that I do for the first year medical students about what is happening in the brain, because it doesn't matter whether you are a person with brain injury yourself, you care about someone with brain injury, or you're a healthcare provider, you need to know the basics of how neuroplasticity works. So we're going to go back to some fundamentals. I'm going to give you some examples and try to convince you that neuroplasticity occurs throughout your life and that it's always something that's available to you, depending on how you approach it. And the third thing are key ingredients to foster neuroplasticity and brain health. So it all starts at the synapse. So what's a synapse? A synapse are the neurons are the building blocks of the central nervous system. And the synapse is when two neurons are communicating with each other. So on this image, this is a cartoon. On the left-hand side, you'll see the main part of a neuron. It's the main machinery. It has the cell's nucleus. The cell says, grow branches, retract branches, make new synapses, take them away. All that happens at the cell body. Then you have a dendrite, and that's the path, that's the highway that you got here. So a synapse, it usually comes into the cell body, information travels down the axon to the very end of the neuron. And at the end of the neuron, we call that a dendrite. So you have synapses on one end, synapses the other, and a highway in between. I'll tell you about the highway. The highway in between is important, and it's coated with a product called myelin. But what's myelin? Myelin is essentially a fatty insulating substance that wraps around that axon. And it's really important for speed of conduction. So just like your wires in your house, if you have spotty, that electrical wire needs to have insulation around it. And if you have damage to that insulation, you're going to have problems with the way electricity is being conducted. So you have a cell body that's governing the activity of a neuron. You have synapse information coming in. It travels down this insulated axon to travel to another neuron. Some neurons are like totally tiny little things you can barely see unless you have a microscope. But some are big, like in this peripheral nervous system, from your leg to your foot. It's about 3 feet long. One of the longest ones in your body, around 3 feet long. So huge range. Next slide. Patrick, thank you very much. He's doing excellent. So how many synapses do you have? This was a study that was just published by the Harvard group in the journal Science. Science is the top journal in the world in science. Here's what they did. So individuals who have epilepsy, sometimes they have to have a piece of brain tissue taken out. That is I'll say, the source of the seizure. So what they did in the course of people who had this surgery, they were able to take out a little piece. The piece was so small. If you have a pen in your hand, it's the very, very tip. The size is the very, very tip of your pen or pencil that you have. That's how small it is, a millimeter squared. In that millimeter cubed, there was 150 million synapses. Just think about the capacity that our brains have to be modifying itself, because I told you that neuroplasticity is at the level of the synapse. It's enormous. So they had to use special AI. They had a room stacked with computers as big as this room to just count these. It's an incredible amount of work. So let's go back to the synapse. So I said the synapse is the connection between one neuron and another neuron. And it itself is a complicated structure that can be modified. So an electrical impulse travels down the axon to the synapse. It triggers a release of neurotransmitters into an empty space. Then those neurotransmitters are taken up by the neighboring neuron. That's how the electrical impulse passes through. And you've heard the word neurotransmitters before, because many drugs that we take, mood alter drugs, illegal and legal, alter neurotransmitter levels. Right? So they're the key structures that are working here. So in this image on the top, you'll see the end of a synapse. It has little bubbles, and the bubbles are filled with neurotransmitters. They flow down to the edge and the end. They open up, pop, they let the neurotransmitter out, and then the neurotransmitter is picked up by the neighbor. It's like handing off one to the next. So your body can do things like package more neurotransmitter in the bubbles, make more bubbles, make the bubbles go faster, make the bubbles go to the end and release quicker, make more receptors or less receptors. So that's how the synapse changes. It can change lots of different ways in response to how you use it. And do you know that we first knew that by a Canadian neuroscientist in 1949? He said, in his way, neurons that fire together, wire together. So presynaptic cells that provide input to a postsynaptic cell, that's what I was just telling you, the one on the top and the one on the bottom, will have their synaptic connections strengthened. Those connections that are not active will gradually have their influence weakened. So plasticity is double-edged. It's not all about learning things, so you also can unlearn things and forget things. So this is an image about myelin to show you how important myelin is. I was going to take my scarf. The more myelin you wrap around that axon, the better it's going to transmit. And what we know is that when you practice things, so for example, people who are really good with their upper limb control, like violinists, people who use their arms a lot, there's such thing as myelin plasticity. So the more you use things, the more myelin gets laid down, and that strengthens the speed of the impulses. It's amazing. It's amazing. Then, of course, you need blood vessels to support all this. And every one of these synapses need energy in hemoglobin, oxygen, and they need glucose, and they need it now. So we call that neurovascular coupling. So the neuron says, I need energy, and you need to have really good blood vessels that provide that energy right away. So a healthy brain tissue all around is really important because the cell is struggling to modify itself and it needs the tools to be able to do that. We have 650 kilometers of blood vessels in our brain. It's enormous. So if you think about, I'm from Newfoundland, like I said, to go from St. John's to Corner Brook would be across the province of Newfoundland. I was talking to a friend of mine who's in Portugal. Portugal's about the same size as the island of Newfoundland. So you travel across Portugal. And that's essentially you've traveled the blood vessels in your brain. So the other thing to know about is your brain is both hardwired and soft-wired to organize itself in a certain pattern. This image is called a homunculus. It looks weird, really weird. It doesn't look like your own body at all. So I want you to do something for me. We're going to try to map out your body. So here's the cool thing. About at the center, if you touch the top of your ears, go ahead and do that. And you make a line to the top of your head, roughly. And in that top, if I were to stick my thumb down, there's like a little fissure there in between because you have two hemispheres. So if I were to stick my thumb down, that's about where my leg is. My whole leg is mapped on a little spot down in the middle of my brain hemispheres about the size of my thumb. But then if I draw a line down and I go about an inch above my ears, that's where my hand area is. Now look at this picture. What's bigger on this brain? The hand or the leg? Hand, right? But what's bigger in real life? Your leg is much bigger than your hand. So here's the beauty of it. The more neurons that are dedicated to the control of that piece of body, the bigger its representation on the brain. Does that make sense? So like your leg, you can stick it. What can you do? You can only do basic movements with your leg. But your hand is exquisite what it can do. And so I told you I work with rats. So rats have beautiful, exquisite control, and we're able to map that also in their little forepaws. But the other thing humans have is we have huge control of our lips. Do you see how big that is on that image? It's huge. Lips, tongue, your throat has a huge area, like pretty much a big chunk of that part of your brain. Why do we have that? Why do humans have such huge, exquisite control of tongue, lips, throat. Speech. Speech. Because we speak and we need that beautiful control for speech. So rats don't have that. Rats have a barrel cortex, which is their whiskers. Yes, so they don't have a speech center, they have a barrel cortex. So the key thing is that the more dedication you have for the movement of that part of your body and control, the bigger area of the brain is responsible for it. Stop me anytime, ask me any questions.
Your speech,
Yeah.
but when it evolves over time, it's like sometimes you can evolve.
You would think, yes, I'm sure it did. And I wonder, like, the work of people who've done, where they've evaluated maybe the cranium size to look and see how the cranium, because the brains would all, of course, there wouldn't be any brain tissue left for our ancestors. But you should be able to tell something from the size of the cranium. It's a really good point. Please stop me anytime. Yes. I'm going to repeat some things for the people online. So yeah, about perhaps even as children, newborns, or our ancestors, we would have maybe a way to vocalize. So, right. So I'm just paraphrasing for the people online who might not be able to hear you, because I think you're making a very good point. That it's not just about speech, the output, but the understanding and the processing of speech. They're probably, the network is still there, and you're trying to utilize it but not able to produce. Yes. Absolutely love that question because, oh, I'm sorry. So the question was about if someone had a spinal cord injury and so they weren't able to use their legs, the brain area that was responsible for the legs, could it be utilized by something else? And so this was asked. It's so difficult to ask, difficult experiment, because you can't really do that experiment. But in people who had amputations of the arm, because I showed you where the arm area and the face are really close, like they're neighbors to one another. So there's a group in the UK who actually used a way to stimulate the brain to figure out so now that you don't have an arm, what is that tissue being used for? And what they found was that it had extended down, so when you touched the face area, people felt it in the phantom arm. They weren't touching the arm, but so it's modifiable and it can be used for other things, which I thought, very good point. Interesting. I wonder how we could capitalize on that a bit more. So keep going. These are great questions. And so back to synapses being modified by behavioral demand, because that is the fundamental aspect of what neuroplasticity is. If anyone asks you what this is, you said neuroplasticity is really about synapses. Synapses are connections between neurons that can be strengthened or weakened depending on what you push them towards. So that's the story. But you know, what the brain also tries to do is package things up so that, you know, when you drove here, maybe you drove here, you didn't think, oh, I'm going to hold my hand at 10 and 2. I'm going to shift, and now I'm watching this car. You don't talk yourself through every step of your driving experience. You just do it, right? You have a package, a driving package. And when you sit in your car and turn on your heated seats, you say, go driving, and you find yourself. Have you ever found yourself somewhere like in the, and sort of realized, oh, the radio was on. Geez, how'd I get here? So that's, you turned your package on and you went to where you were supposed to go and you didn't think about it. So the brain tries to save energy by creating packages. And I think about, oh, sorry, continue.
Sometimes, in the car, when I first stopped find my feet, where am I going? Where am I going? Well, that's another story. But yes, you have a package.
Right. So we have a lot of automated packages that's taken years and years to develop. And those are usually deep within the brain, and we access them when we need them. For example, I gave this example here in this image of a child learning how to write their name. And have you ever watched children, when they learn something new, they have the effort movement. They're tight, and they're like this, and they're, you know, everything's so hard, and it's not smooth. Same way when have you ever tried to teach young people how to drive? You know, the response is just not, you know, where you want it to be. And I said, well, why don't we turn off the radio? Let's start with that. Because too much information, just focus on the task that you have. But then before you know it, it all happens. You don't think about writing your name. You just write it. You just use your cursive and you sign your name. Nobody thinks it. Yes.
Several years ago, I stepped on black ice. Years ago, first remember all happened in the dream. Somehow I was able to myself up, have my glasses, be able to cross the third grade, walk in the door, get to my building, get 2 feet out the door, walk into my apartment. You think I don't live hard today. You think I know I'm standing in my apartment, go to the back of my head and do a toothpaste. There must be some quote unquote memory.
Right. Yeah.
I have no recollection.
Right. I'm going to paraphrase that for you, that you hit your head. At that moment, you probably disoriented, but you were able to access previous memories and packages that got you home safely. But like you said, not without having a brain injury. Yeah. So we have packages. There's also differences amongst us all. So depending on the kinds of backgrounds we've had. For example, here's an interesting fact. There are a group of people whose job it is to translate from text to Braille. And so they use the tips of their fingers. And from Monday to Friday, that's their job. And then Saturday and Sunday, they're off. So when you image their brains, they have larger representations of the tips of their fingers than you and I'm assuming, you know, it's a specialized thing that you and I would have, which is very cool. And also, professional violinists and cellists have larger representation for their left playing hand than people who are not. and it depends on how much you practice. So professionals have a larger representation than amateurs. So there's hard wiring, but there's also some soft wiring that's happening depending on how much you train. All animals, including humans, have the capacity to learn. Learning is neuroplasticity. So whether it's relearning a new way to do something, learning something entirely new, or recovering from a brain injury, it's all learning. And learning is the strengthening and changing of those synapses. So all humans and all animals have this capacity to learn. So you can take on things like a new language. So if you want to learn a new language, you want to learn a new sport, whatever it is, it's just that it's going to take a lot of work on your part. This is not something you're going to do in an hour a day. So research tells us that you would need to do 10,000 hours of practice to become proficient and somewhat expert in something new. 10,000 hours. Think about how rehabilitation is structured in many cases. So many times it's time limited. So you get a certain amount of rehabilitation. It might be an hour a day for 6 weeks. It's not nearly enough. Not nearly enough. So how does that happen? It only happens when you engage, when you have family members, and this has been my experience, is that people who have family members who structure practice and make sure people get in that practice every single day, those people with brain injury do much better. But it takes a long time. Neuroplasticity is the long game. It's the long game. So there's a cool TEDx talk, which I've given you, Josh Kaufman, and he talks about the first 20 hours. So, and even to take on something new, if you watch that TEDx talk, it's a fun talk, but it'll give you the principles of what he's saying about what the research says. Those first 20 hours, you can learn, but really 10,000 hours is the dedicated time you need. Think about 10,000 hours. That's a lot of time. And he talks about, he summarized how to learn, and I like the way he's explained it. So, and it's exactly what, if you were to learn speech and language, if you were to relearn to use your arm, relearn gait and balance, a therapist would help you with this. So they deconstruct what they want you to learn, the pieces. So it might be walking. So we say, okay, what about walking? You strike your heel first, put your weight on your leg, you practice the shift, you move your other leg. They'll break it up into all kinds of bits and put it together. It's okay. You make mistakes, you fix it, you look in the mirror, you see where you are, but you're practicing by deconstructing and then putting it back together. Learn enough about what you want to learn to self-correct. Like, okay, that's not right. I videotape myself and say, that's not working. So know enough about what it is you want to learn so that you can correct yourself. Remove barriers to practice, like distractions, and practice at least to get started for 20 hours. And like I said, 10,000 hours if you want to lay it down in your brain and build a motor package. So after an injury to the brain, if people have heard the term window of plasticity. And what that means is that there are windows or opportunities where your brain is primed, that cell body says, go, 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 repair, fix, connect. It happens in specific periods of your life, and they're called critical periods. So for example, children, if you wanted a child to become multilingual, you would need to expose them to multiple languages before the age of about 8. Because the brain is ready developmentally, and then those cell bodies are ready to build synapses related to language. So to capitalize on that, and for them to become native speakers, they would have to be exposed intensively to that language before the age of 8. You've heard stories, these horrendous stories about children who've been raised in socially deprived situations, in understairs, terrible, abusive situations. And even when the children are discovered in 13, 14 years old, and they try to move them to an enriched environment, the children never develop the cognitive capacity and the social emotional capacity because they missed the window of opportunity. So you say there's windows for certain things. One of those windows is after an injury to the brain. So after an injury to anywhere in the central nervous system, there's always inflammation first. So in this image, I'm giving you it as red, inflammation. That's around in this circle, I'd say, imagine in this map of time, starting from January to December, you had your injury at Christmas. January and February would be inflammation time. And it's going to take time for the inflammation to come up, and things are going to look bad because neurons don't like inflammation in general. So, and then that has to resolve. Then the yellow, the light yellow, that's repair. So the connections are being made to neurons that are like partly functional over the next 4 months or so. Then relearning takes place. So people think about the recovery that they see after a person has an injury to the central nervous system, and they see that really the big recovery starts in that first 3 to 6 months. I argue is that is the resolution of inflammation and the natural repair process. Actually, neuroplasticity takes a lot longer, and it's the long game. So another way to look at this, I've shown you in another image. If you think about the percentage of recovery on the upright axis on my little graph, you'll see pink, that first, before 3 months, inflammation resolves first. Then it's the yellowy pink, then repair takes place, then relearning happens. So most of that really rapid change that you see in recovery so when you're helping people, you say that's the inflammation and the repair happening. It's getting your brain ready for the hard work that's going to happen next. So I'll talk about Mike. So Mike had a stroke that affected the left hemisphere of his brain, and he lost all of his speech. He also had weakness of his right arm and his right leg as a result of his stroke. And he, over time, about 6 months or so, he was able to walk with a cane. But whenever you'd ask, so he's a real estate agent, and according to his wife, could talk the talk and, sell ice. When you'd say, Mike, how are you doing? Fine. And I'd say, so where's, his wife's name? Fine. So he could only say the word fine. That would be, but I sensed that he understood what I was saying, but he couldn't say any of the words. So maybe I'd see him periodically. He'd be there. He'd be at the Miller Center for Speech Therapy, and he would answer me with fine. And one day, I don't know, it was maybe 18 months or 2 years later, I happened to be in the lobby and, Mike, how are you doing? Fine. How are you? And my mouth just went, I couldn't believe it that he spoke to me. And I said, Mike, your speech. He said, yes, coming back. And I was like, my heart was going out of my chest to witness it. I was witnessing it. And I said, how did this happen? And he said he had a group of guys that would get together, and this is when newspapers, like the Evening Telegram, was in print, which, hard to get any print newspapers now. But he would sit around and they would take this print newspaper and take the time, and Mike would read a sentence or try to read a sentence. They would debate it and they would wait. So, because sometimes with people with speech problems, one of the challenges is us. We insert the words and don't give people time to formulate the answers. And so he had a group who did this every week, and then he practiced on his own. And it took 18 months, 2 years, but he could speak. I know somebody else since that who used karaoke and did his own karaoke, and now he goes downtown St. John's and he's actually karaoke king. He actually rehabilitated his own speech with karaoke. So it just shows you it's there, there's capability. It's just that it takes a lot of work. I'll also mention that neuroplasticity is double-edged, which we talked about. You can learn things that are good, adaptive, and helpful to you, and you can learn things that are maladaptive and not helpful to you. I give this example because this is a gait pattern that some people develop when they have weakness in their hip. It's called a Trendelenburg, and you stick your hip up like that. The trouble is when you keep doing that over and over and over, it's not about the weakness anymore. It's about neuroplasticity. It's like, but you've learned. So now, unfortunately, we have to unlearn this behavior and layer on a normal behavior. So I always say, people say, practice makes perfect. I said, no, it doesn't. Practice makes permanent, good or bad. So in terms of plasticity, things that are on your side, a younger brain has better capacity. A healthy brain. If you exercise, you have really good blood supply in the tissues, really ready to support those neurons. You're getting good sleep, so you can focus on what you need to focus on. You have healthy diet with antioxidants, because like I said, the brain after injury is dealing with a lot of inflammation, and your body has to get rid of it. And cognitive stimulation. Things that are going against you would be more like an older brain, a lot of stress, smoking, exposure to toxins, and alcohol. And alcohol is known to have damaging effects on synapses and cause the brain to atrophy. The last thing I'll mention is a tool for you called Google Scholar. Everybody knows about Google. They say, oh, I'll check Dr. Google. I'm going to show you even something better. This is called Google Scholar. Unless you searched for it in Google, you wouldn't even know it existed. But it's for geeks. Okay? So what you do is you put your term in the search bar. Okay, so for example, I put in a term there for you. Speech, I put in and recovery, because I was talking about Mike, and stroke. And what that does, it'll search through all the research in the world and bring me back the papers that relate to those 3 words put together, and it'll sort them by citations. So the most highly cited papers down to, that's my little gift to you. use it, because so much of the things you're finding online is really garbage. So find that. Yes.
When you say Google Scholar, can a person go to Google and type that in?
You type it right in.
Google.
Type it in Google, Google Scholar,
Type in
and
Google
it'll
Scholar.
give you a new search. I don't know why everyone doesn't already know about it. It's used all the time. So here's my list. These are the top 4 papers. You can click on the papers and read the papers. Even the title, they have summaries. It's great. So, yes. I'm wondering, this is Google, but I'm wading through all This is a crime. Yeah. Yeah. But with Google Scholar, you do need to direct what you, like, if you just said brain and injury, you get everything. So you do want to use your and function. Specifically, what is it that you want? So even spinal cord injury, make sure you use spinal and cord and injury and walking and it'll narrow down your search. And there's no ads. It's great. I'm not an advertisement for Google. This is what we use. So, I use my medical library, PubMed, but I use Google Scholar a lot. Thank you.
I was in a head-on collision in a blizzard with one of my daughters in the back. I just pulled over and the other vehicle lost control and I flipped out because my daughter was with me. I had a meltdown and it wasn't good. Waking up the next day and I was all like out of sorts, wasn't thinking right. The lights were really bugging me. And then somebody told me, you should probably call lawyers. And I ended up looking up Valent, and I got a hold of a guy named Phil Marrera, and then he began the process of taking care of me. He just always made me feel like welcome, and then as time went on, he's became like one of my buddies. And it turned out that my injuries were fairly bad. They never rushed for settlements. They were making them offers in the beginning. They told them, no, this is a head injury. We can't rush this stuff. And they were right in the end. So I would totally recommend them, and I totally thank them because my family's life is a whole lot better now than it was gonna be. Big time, for real.
Ten years ago, our family was doing quite well. We were traveling, we were having a good time, and then life surprised us. We were driving in a snowstorm. There was sudden black ice, and we got hit by a truck, and my then 6-year-old daughter died on sight. After the accident, the worst things happen. You're all by yourself, you have very little support, and you really don't know where to start. Most lawyers did a good job, they did the papers, they were there, but Valent Legal went far, far beyond. When I was in trouble, I felt comfortable enough to actually call. They would go really far their way to make my family feel better. So if you're in a tragic situation, you're stuck, and you need an accident lawyer, I can recommend Valent wholeheartedly. Thank you, Valent.
Test, test. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay in the back, around the room? I'm a low speaker. We'll do this. I'm also setting a timer because I'm a horrible tracker of time, and I've got Stephanie helping out as well. Okay, perfect. If you lose my voice, just please let me know, and I'll try to project a little bit more. Start. So as mentioned, my name is Ainsley. I'm a social worker with the Acquired Brain Injury Program out of Nova Scotia Health. I work with two different services there out of the Bedford Neuro Commons. One is the ABI Outreach Service, which is in the community, a multidisciplinary team, got social work, a physiotherapy, occupational therapy, a behaviorist, and a recreation therapist. And I also work 0.5 position, half my position with outpatient social work service, which is primarily a counseling service to support folks who have been affected by or with their mental health after experiencing a brain injury. And I've been there for about 12 years, give or take a mat leave. And I just want to say it's a real honor to be here with all of you today and seeing some familiar faces, also some other colleagues and community partners. It's been really hard to follow that presentation, wonderfully done by Dr. Plowman. Am I saying your name correctly? Yeah, that was wonderful. So my topic today is a big one, and it can be a tricky one. So I'm going to be chatting about kind of the intersection of acquired brain injury and mental health. And so I just want to encourage everybody to take really good care of themselves here and afterwards. Sometimes, you know, the topic can be a little bit triggering for folks. I also just, in recognition of the space here, this is really weird for me to be presenting. I do group facilitation and I do one-on-one in my work. And so here, kind of projecting out without a great opportunity for interaction. I invite questions or comments throughout, but it might just be a little bit tricky to support that. So we'll see how it goes. And yeah, so there's our overview, just quite simply, what do we mean by mental health? So just kind of finding some common language and a definition for that. What influences mental health generally and after acquired brain injury specifically? What helps protect or improve mental health after ABI? I'll be using the acronym ABI quite commonly just to shorten things up a little bit for acquired brain injury. And just a very quick overview of community-based programs and services that can help support mental health needs, social needs, et cetera, in our local community, recognizing that we also have an audience from across the country, which is really cool. So mental health and mental illness are not the same thing. So here today, I'm going to be talking about mental health. Someone with a mental illness could have poor mental health and vice versa. Somebody with a diagnosed mental illness could also have excellent mental health in their day-to-day lives, right? So I think that's an important distinguishment. We often think about mental health as, you know, something that is diagnosed or, you know, a condition that needs some pretty rigorous treatment or medication. So we're just going to think a little bit more broadly about that today. And from the Canadian Mental Health Association in 2021, they just described mental health as including our emotions, feelings of connection to others, our thoughts, and being able to manage life's highs and lows. So essentially, anything from how we think, how we feel, how we enter into relationships with other people and connect, how we perceive and interpret the world around us, and how we cope, right? So we now understand that our minds and our bodies are actually connected and integrated We are not floating heads. So when we talk about treating or supporting mental health needs, it's important to recognize that as I said, minds and bodies are connected. So kind of avenues for supporting that need to take kind of different forms. So we're kind of moving away from that disease model of mental health care, which essentially included labeling what's wrong with somebody and using interventions to fix it, right? And we know that mental health and wellness is so much more than that, fortunately. It was very much focused on symptom elimination. And I know for anybody who's ever experienced challenges with their mental health, of course, that would be a goal. Who wouldn't want to get rid of unwanted, unhelpful thoughts and emotions or behaviors that can greatly impact quality of life? So it makes a lot of sense that would be the hope. So we're looking at addressing physical, emotional, social, and spiritual well-being when we're looking at mental health care and closing those gaps when possible. And that's a big part of as a social worker in a counseling service with outpatient care. Those are, the types of approaches that we take and the factors that we're looking at in supporting those needs. Even the word recover typically implies, recovering from a physical injury. So the word recovery in its Greek origins actually comes from the idea, or it means rather, to find again. Okay. So recovering what has been lost or reconnecting with the self can be challenging after brain injury. So I hear a lot from folks who are living with the injury that it can be really hard to figure that piece out if you feel changed. So who am I now? What is this self that I'm trying to get back to? So recovery takes on a whole different meaning when we think of it that way as it relates to our mental health on a deeper level. And then as social workers, we very much approach mental health care as kind of a person in environment type of situation. So we don't just look at the individual and the psychological problems they may be having, so to speak, but more what is also influencing how they're feeling about themselves or their situation from a broader level, and what environmental factors may be at play as well. And I'll hope to touch on some of those in this presentation. And so just very quickly, I'm not going to go into these. So just in terms of those potential environmental factors, these are our Health Canada social determinants of health. And mental health is health. So if you just take a quick look at those, if you can see them, I'm appreciating that they're kind of small there, but things like income and income distribution. Income, we recognize with many of those others, can also impact, things like housing, safe and accessible and affordable housing these days, as we all know, is not easy to come by. Social exclusion, disability is on there, employment and working conditions, right? So these are all known as factors. Yes, sir.
Is it fair to say that not necessarily in that order?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. I don't think they're meant to be linear. Yeah, good question. Thank you. Yeah. So yeah, positive or negative impact depending on access to resources and kind of where you lie in kind of having some of those barriers working against you at times. And so just breaking that down a little bit further, recognizing that we don't all have the same level of privilege, we don't all have the same head start, and then throw some health changes, in the mix on top of that with a brain injury. It really kind of changes that idea of equality versus equity. So equality means that everybody is given the same resources or opportunities. And equity, as this image is meant to represent, is providing each person with the specific resources they need to be successful. right? And those resources can mean a whole lot as it relates to one's mental health. So, ABI and mental health. So, just looking at what is it about living with ABI that can put folks at higher risk of changes or challenges to their mental health. So this is certainly not intended to be an exhaustive list. Um, and in some cases, it was a bit tricky for me to prepare this presentation as it's a mixed audience. You know, I want to be speaking to loved ones and caregivers, folks with lived experience, community partners. So I'm trying to kind of represent just a little bit more broadly, but specific to how I hear about the day-to-day challenges from the individuals that I've worked with over the years. And so these would be known as some of the risk factors. So maybe starting with the idea of isolation. So whether that's social isolation after experiencing a brain injury, um, perhaps you were working before and losing access if you have to take some time off work or no longer able to return to your place of employment. Maybe that was your friend group. That could have been a big part of your social life. So losing access to that can absolutely lead to that sense of isolation in the community. Sometimes it means literal isolation from inaccessibility. So whether that be transportation barriers, um, it could be, any number of things there. Also symptom-based. So for folks after brain injury, we were talking about speech and communication earlier. So if you have aphasia, as an example, after a brain injury, so communication change, that can be incredibly isolating if you're no longer able to participate in the way that you once did in conversations in social settings. Dysphagia, swallowing difficulties. So much of our social time can be centered around food and drink. So if that sets you apart and gathering with a good meal with friends is isolating you or setting you apart, if you can't chew and swallow food in the same way, it can be isolating as well. Memory changes, all kinds of different ways. Stigma as well. I don't have to tell a lot of you about stigma and how that can play out in the community in terms of, sometimes those really subtle changes or symptoms, and sometimes more physically, present ones. It can be some false assumptions can easily be made in terms of your abilities in ways that kind of put many people in positions of having to really advocate for themselves. And you're busy just surviving and then recovering, and having to advocate for yourself can add a whole other layer of stress, which can impact mental health as well. Other situational ones as well that we'll get to. There's also a grieving process. So grief and loss, we don't talk about grieving a whole lot in the context of living with a brain injury. And so what do we often think of when we talk about grief? What does that word kind of generate in terms of what it means that somebody dies? Yeah, yeah. So it's messy when you're here, you're alive, and you feel different, you are changed. And so there's a term for this. I'm going to give a shout out to Shelley Pick over here at the front table, who has delivered some wonderful presentations on the topic of ambiguous loss as a different kind of loss that really resonates for lots of people and loved ones, caregivers, after a brain injury is experienced. And I won't do it as much justice, but essentially my understanding is that, it kind of applies to folks. Number one, there's no grieving ritual, right? You're here, so there aren't those normal rituals as we would have when there's a death in your community or your family. Everyone gathers around, there's an obvious sign of needing support. For lots of people after an acquired brain injury, they say, yeah, everyone was coming around that first few months, and then Where did they go? You know, meanwhile, that might be the most critical stage of needing that support and gathering of your loved ones and your support systems. So ambiguity, ambiguous loss means kind of an inexactness, like a messiness. I like to think of it as, you know, in lieu of, you know, that traditional way of grieving something. Shelley, unresolved. Thank you, Shelley. Yeah, because it goes on. Yeah, yeah. Changes in the brain, so that kind of neurophysiology. And I'm not going to even try to pretend that I understand all the neuroscience stuff, Dr. Plowman, with this one, but those brain chemicals, right? So those pathways in the brain that after injury change, your brain may not be producing the same kind of feel-good hormones and chemicals that allow us to stay stable in our mental health or feel better when we're feeling down, for example. Um, some people experience, you know, have already been experiencing mental health challenges before their brain injury. So sometimes what happens is it feels different, it manifests differently, and the usual ways of managing mental health difficulties before a brain injury might no longer be as effective. Right? And I'll touch on that in a moment as well. Actually, I think I'll just jump down to, no, I'll get myself out of order. Role and relationship changes. That ripple effect of ABI. So we know that when one person suffers a brain injury, all the people around them are shuffling and shifting in what they need to take on for a while by way of responsibilities. And sometimes that means, you know, in partnership with somebody, the loved one or the partner rather, spouse perhaps, becomes a caregiver. And that can be very much unwanted and unexpected and be very confusing for both parties to kind of sort that out. How do we maintain a partnership while also, you know, having one of us kind of picking up some of the responsibilities in different ways? And when I say caregiving, I don't necessarily mean providing physical care. All aspects of caregiving, emotional care, day-to-day duties, responsibilities, and sometimes physical care. Inaccessible coping outlets. So back to that part about the changes in the brain, and if you had mental health changes as a result of a brain injury, the old ways that perhaps you were managing your mental health might no longer be as accessible. So for some people who come in to see me, they may have used productivity to manage stress in a big way. They may have just stayed very busy and maintain that really well in their day-to-day lives as a way sometimes to avoid, you know, painful parts of their past or their troubles. They have a brain injury, they can no longer work or stay as busy as they could for a while, for some folks on a long-term basis, and they don't know what to do with themselves. They're lacking that outlet. For other people, it may have been physical outlets, so changes to mobility. If you've been one to always manage stress or stay balanced through yoga or running or speed skating, anything, and that was your primary outlet after brain injury from fatigue, mobility changes, strength, coordination, anything physically related, you may be then lacking that outlet as well. So it can be a long road and take some creativity to find other things to fill those gaps. Okay. Does that sound familiar to some? Yeah. Trauma. Trauma. Here he is. This could be a whole other presentation, and won't really have time to do it a whole lot of justice, but before I get to this gentleman, just quickly in terms of a few really key ways that he defines trauma and how that I think is so relevant to living with brain injury. trauma after brain injury is quite unique in that it is a threat or a perceived threat that continues to live in your body, right? So for some people, oh, here I am using my phone for a timer and it's ringing. I'm glad I have it off. Off. Sorry about that. So yeah, I just completely lost my train of thought. Sorry about that. Technology, man, it gets us every time. Yes, living in your body. So for some people after stroke, as an example, that acute, if they remember how it felt to be having the stroke, intense fatigue, brain fog, list 10 others, right? From what they remember about that experience, perhaps speech changes as well. Months later, after they get home, if they have, a flare up, they'll often call it a flare up. They may have overdone it. They're intensely fatigued. They're under a lot of stress. They get sick with something else. And all of a sudden in their body, they're feeling the trauma all over again and worrying that they're having another stroke, and it feels the same. So we see lots of people going back to the emergency department just to get things checked out, and we very much condone that. But it can feel very real, and it can have those lasting effects. So just quickly on Dr. Gabor Mate, he calls trauma soul wounds, right? Wounds of the soul. And again, in the Greek language, I'm all about the Greek language today, the root word of trauma is actually a wound, right? So he talks about trauma as not what happens to you. Some people will ask that, well, why do I feel traumatized by having experienced this brain injury? And this next fella, who comes with me to the day program, seems fine, and his mental health is fine. Why me? So Dr. Mate says it's not what happens to you, but what happens inside of you as a result of what happens to you. And he also talks about big T trauma and little t trauma. Little t trauma sometimes as needs unmet, right? So not what happened to you, but what should have happened for you and didn't. And sometimes we hear those stories too of folks who, if they were experiencing a stroke or had multiple concussions or other forms of brain injury, they may have not felt cared for through the healthcare system, and they feel trauma from that, right? From feeling like something was missed or delayed. So, lastly, Dr. Mate also talks about how mental illness in general begins as a normal response to abnormal circumstances, right? So it's normal for our brains to try to protect us and to send us into fight, flight, freeze mode as a way to protect us. Yes.
The word normal, years ago when I heard the word normal is an overused or underused word where you are and you are.
I agree. I agree. I hope I put that in quotations for, yeah, in his version of normal. Yeah, exactly. What is normal? Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, thank you. Nope, it's good. It's
None of
good.
us are normal.
Yeah. Buffers. So let's get to the good stuff. So we've talked about some of those factors that can influence mental health after brain injury. Let's talk about what we can do about it, right? So I tried to make some of these considerations as actionable as possible, you'll see. And again, not meant to be exhaustive, but hopefully just looking at an overview of things that can promote or disrupt kind of that path of difficulties with your mental health. So, just very quickly, some of you may be quite familiar with this. We need to have basic needs met first before we can feel well spiritually, mentally, psychologically. So this is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm not going to spend much time on it, but if you look at those bottom three parts of this pyramid, if you can see those. So the bottom one is physiological needs: air, food, water, shelter, clothing, reproduction, sleep, basic needs, survival, in other words. Next one up, safety, security, employment, income, right? Affordability of living, resources, property, health. And next one, love and belonging, friendship, love, intimacy, family, community. Right? So the idea here is that you have to have that lowest, the base of the pyramid met first before you can ever kind of move on and feel secure in those next considerations. I just like the word buffer. So here, literally from the dictionary, buffer means a device or material for reducing shock resulting from contact, or something that serves as a protective barrier. So for the sake of this, we're looking at what are some of those practices, circumstances, and actions that can either help soften the effects of mental health difficulties or lower the likelihood of developing poor mental health or it worsening. There's no guidebook for this, right? Everyone is different, everyone has different circumstances, but here are some things that I thought might be helpful or important. What are we doing for time? About 10-ish minutes? Okay. Educating yourself on your brain injury, right? So it's that idea of I don't know what I don't know, right? So understanding your brain injury can help improve your self-awareness, right? Your insight, in order to help guide then what you do, right? What you do about it, what types of services and supports you may seek out or agree to if they're being offered to you in that rehabilitative stage. And when I say rehabilitative stage, that could be lifelong, right? Early, middle, later. It can validate your experience too. Instead of feeling like there's something wrong with you, knowing that brain injury can mean that you feel more depressed at times, that you may behave more impulsively than you did before, that you may verbally share things that are really private and sensitive in a way that others may deem socially inappropriate. All those things that can impact your mental health can be a result of the brain, misunderstood by others, but understanding for yourself where that's coming from, and hopefully your loved ones and supports as well, can go a long way. It can also foster self-compassion. You understand that it's your brain, causing some of these things and causing you to feel a different way. It can go a long way in terms of being able to then offer yourself some kindness. And seeking out opportunities for learning, either formally or informally. I just shouted out, is it up there? Yep, the ABI Day program is one such. We'll be talking very briefly about community-based resources at the end, but through the program that I work with out in the Bedford Neurocommons, we do have kind of a skill building, educational group treatment program specifically for that, to learn more about brain injury and developing skills to manage the effects of that brain injury more effectively. And lastly, tracking patterns of things like triggers or reactions. So that idea of what's setting me off. If you can find some of those common patterns, especially if part of your mental health changes involve some emotional dysregulation or behavioral dysregulation, it can be really important to try to look for some of those patterns to help offset them or prevent them altogether when possible.
Understanding the ABI,
Yeah.
TBI could be replaced by TBI.
Yes, absolutely. So ABI, thank you. That's something I should have clarified up front. So acquired brain injury is the umbrella term that we use to encompass any brain injury that is not progressive, or what's the other word, Lynn? You're always good with this one. Do you remember? Not born with it. Yeah, so it's things like TBI, not born with it. Congenital is the word I think I was trying to think of. Yeah. So anything else that is acquired, right? You suffer a brain injury or something happens in your brain after birth. Yeah. Traumatic brain injury, stroke, tumors, cancer and cancer treatments, seizure disorders, they go on and on. Yeah. Thank you. Next one. This is a big one. Again, this could be a whole day, but hope, right? That idea of practicing hope and recognizing that hope is not an emotion, right? So, in other words, it's not just somewhere you get and land there and stay there. It's actually a way of thinking or a cognitive process. So, I'm going to quote Brené Brown here. She's a social worker, researcher, speaker, author. And she describes that hope happens when we have the ability to set realistic goals. So I know where I want to go. We're able to figure out how to achieve those goals, including the ability to stay flexible and develop alternative routes when something's not working. I know how to get there, I'm persistent, and I can tolerate disappointment and try again. And we believe in ourselves. I can do this. Okay? So that touches on a lot of different things. It's quite a process. And she makes it sound really easy, doesn't she? But that is the practice of hope. And in rehab, we often use a framework called goal, plan, do, review that kind of speaks to this, right? So kind of setting a goal for now based on abilities and function, making a plan, doing the plan, executing the plan could be a task, right? And then reviewing, oftentimes with feedback from loved ones or a health professional, how that went, how you would do it differently, what symptoms got in the way to try again differently the next time, right? So a bit of trial and error, but a really specific kind of framework for that. I might have to skip this one for the sake of time, but that's just more, maybe just briefly, it's this concept that's been introduced to us. The two authors and podcasters at the bottom are palliative care physicians who have introduced this concept of walking two roads. So it's essentially balancing, as part of maintaining hope, right, practicing hope, balancing positivity and realistic planning. So the walking two roads is a metaphor, right? So if you picture yourself walking down one road and parallel to yourself in the same direction, one road is the hope, so maintaining optimism for whether it be a cure for some, for full recovery, back to baseline, right? That ultimate hope of what most people want for themselves or maybe find themselves fantasizing about after brain injury, getting to that place that you envision. On the other road, as you're walking along, the idea is, and not 50-50 necessarily, you may ebb and flow, but the other side is realistic planning based on how you're doing now and what's realistic now, right? So trying to hold on to both of those, not waiting for the hope end goal to happen while you're also doing that planning and living life in the moment now within the reality of your situation. Acceptance, another big word, another big one. Exercising it over and over and over again. So also a process, right? Not linear. We don't just get there and stay there. It's also not an emotion. And it also doesn't mean to give up or a resignation, right? I think sometimes when we hear that word, just accept it, it can imply just get over it, right? Or stop worrying about it. And that's not what we mean here by acceptance. Acceptance as a process is a skill, right? And it's looking at accepting all of the emotional states that you may encounter, the good, the bad, and the ugly, sometimes the despair, the sadness, the enthusiasm, the hope. So allowing for all of those to take place, yes? Oh, I love that. So this, I'll repeat that. Acceptance is the pathway to peace. Yeah. Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. Yeah. And the other part of acceptance, besides your emotional experience as you grieve those losses, is of the uncontrollable events, right? So working on the controllable events or the controllable factors of your health and wellness, and practicing the skill of learning to accept or coming to an acceptance of what you cannot control. Tricky stuff, big stuff, no question about it. Choice and autonomy. Oh, I'm so mindful of time. I'm going to try to speed up. Exerting agency. So everyone's need to have choice in their care, in their day-to-day lives, in reestablishing their whole identity after brain injury. And what one person may feel they need as a survivor of brain injury may sometimes come into direct conflict with their caregivers, loved ones, and it can be a lot to negotiate. So oftentimes, in my role in outreach, there can be a lot of kind of mediating conversations with family members around the concept of safety and what's safety enough, and that idea of dignity of risk, right? If some people, want to make decisions for themselves that may not be the safest or go against recommendations by a rehab team, it's kind of balancing how might we be able to mitigate some of those risks and support everyone involved while allowing that person to have a say and to have some power and agency in that. And that can take all kinds of different forms, but we'll keep going. Finding your role, meaning, and purpose. So that word crisis, lots of people find themselves in crisis after a brain injury. Brain injuries are, as you know, unpredicted, abrupt, sudden. No one's expecting it to happen. So that crisis can be an identity crisis, right? The word crisis in Chinese language is 2 characters, danger and opportunity. Right? So we're talking about opportunity here as well, and starting small. So for lots of people, soon, early into their rehab process, there can be a real, understandably, but a real sense of urgency to get back to life, get back to what they were doing before, get back to their work, get back to their roles within their family, being productive, right? That idea of being productive. We are human beings, we're not human doings, right? And it's easy to say, and when that, is kind of day-to-day life, trying to figure out what that looks like, it can be a real challenge. And Stacey Haynes talks about kind of breaking that down, kind of boiling down the Maslow hierarchy of needs to 3 categories: dignity, safety, and belonging. We all need that. We are born to need to have those needs. We are wired that way. And then just quickly down at the bottom, because I work with some really fabulous recreation therapists, that role of leisure and recreation, finding ways to contribute, in some cases to a community, having a purpose through a role, but also what you get from that, right? Coming into community, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, and the value of finding things that are meaningful and purposeful to you on a very personal level. And resilience, another big one, feeding it. So resilience, we know, is a protective factor against depression. And we also often have that misconception that to be resilient, you either have it or you don't, right? Some people are resilient or they're not. There's actually a lot of newer research. There's a gentleman here at the social work school. Oh my goodness, I can't remember his name, but he's a professor at Dalhousie, and he researches resilience, and he describes it as twofold. So one, kind of how we're wired, how we're born, the neurobiology of our brains, genetics, all that good stuff, but also a combination of psychological factors, so optimism, humor, the flexibility of our thinking, acceptance, spirituality, social supports, coping styles, and skills. So there's a lot that can go into that in terms of how we can cultivate resilience on top of whether we have it or not, right? A lot more nuanced. Are you going to say something?
We can cultivate resilience like that normally or natural.
That's the idea.
So that's a question.
Yeah, yeah. And I just thought of this, the professor's name, Dr. Michael Ungar. That's it. Yes. Yes. Yeah. I love that. Mhm. Mhm. I think it used to be. It used to be. Yeah. 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 So just to paraphrase, resilience as a process of skill building. Absolutely. Yeah. I've heard it described as a state and a trait, right? A trait that we have or a state that we can achieve. And it can be fluid, right? It can come and go depending on how we're doing at the time, too, right? Yeah. Yeah. So 5 more minutes. Okay. We'll skip this one. This is just a fun little um, chart. It's really easy to find online. At the very bottom, if anybody wants to jot down ACS compassion. ACS, yeah. Um, Despite that, it may be really tricky with screens for some of you, but it's easy to find that way. And it's just the different kind of feel-good hormones and day-to-day practices that we can um, do and work on that can help us access those or help with their production. Get a picture. Pause. No problem. Yeah. Yeah. And building your toolkit. There it is. So resourcing yourself, right? Developing coping strategies or skills to self-manage when possible some of the challenges you may be having with your mental health. The idea of becoming your own caregiver, right? So tending to your mental health in whatever way possible to prioritize your personal needs and all of those little practices day in, day out that you know can be helpful and trying to protect those with all of your might. So tools to help your support yourself inside of a difficult position or situation rather. So again, that idea of the two parallel roads, the walking two roads, doing now while still having that hope, those very practical day-to-day tools. And seeking professional guidance if you can. So that's sometimes somebody like me or just working with somebody in the field of mental health or brain injury supports. It can be quite informal, but learning from others what they're doing that helps, right? And adopting some of those practices can go a long way. We're not meant to do this alone. We're not meant to do life alone, and certainly not living with brain injury alone. So gathering that idea of community, right? Connecting with other folks who've been affected, seeking them out. We've got some wonderful community-based resources that provide some avenues for that. I'll just very quickly touch on those. But my colleague, Colleen from Recreation Therapy, often talks about the idea of intermittent support. So especially in that long-term journey of recovery from brain injury, the value of from time to time having a touch point, right? And your needs are likely to shift and ebb and flow over the years through that journey. So finding that right set of supports or those right people for yourself along the way can be so, so critical. And yeah, we'll skip the other quote, ending here just with a quick no, that's okay, Patrick. Yeah, I'm appreciating the time. So what's out there, again, not an exhaustive list, but just starting up at the top at the Bedford Neurocommons where our services are located. We have, a double ABI outpatient social work support. Sorry for the typo there. And that's a counseling service. Myself and my colleague Martin see folks with difficulties adjusting, coping, maybe experiencing depression, anxiety, and needing a bit of support short term for those things. We have an outreach service, as I mentioned. We go out in the community. Typically, we work with folks in that early stage, helping to transition out of hospital to home or out of an inpatient rehab setting to home. We also have that day program that I briefly mentioned, and I'm just going to point Lynn out, our Nova Scotia Health booth over there, or table. She's got a broader kind of list of services, both at where our office is located and also at the rehab center downtown Halifax. And we also have an ABI family support group that some of us facilitate just for loved ones and caregivers. An 8-week consecutive group, semi-structured, for individuals, supporting individuals who have suffered a brain injury, just for them. I won't go into a whole lot of detail with the rest of them, but just this is aimed to be more specific to mental health and social supports after ABI. So community mental health through Nova Scotia Health. Couch of Hope in Dartmouth offers low cost or free counseling, short term. People's Clinic is short term free counseling in Halifax. We have the mental health mobile crisis team for anyone experiencing acute mental health challenges or just really needing immediate support. You can always call 24/7. They are available. Those are their phone numbers. Community health teams has all kinds of in-person and online programs aimed at health and wellness, some of which are quite relevant to living with symptoms of brain injury and overall health as well. Peter's Place, who are representing here, March of Dimes, who are here, Brain Injury Nova Scotia, Northwood day programs, adult day programs, they're not on here, but lots of our community partners who are present, and the Dartmouth and Halifax stroke clubs, just really lovely little peer-led communities of people. They've been running for years, social and leisure focused, that anyone can join. And if you just want to switch, my email is at the back as well. There it is. If anybody has any questions about any of those services, do feel free to reach out to me. And I will respond. And I just want to get to my takeaway slide right before that. And then maybe we can leave just my email up in case anybody wants it. Change happens one action at a time. Recovery usually means a return to another version of you. And we're not meant to do this alone, once again. Thank you so much for having me.
Over 400 Canadians suffer a serious brain injury every single day in this country. And statistics show that approximately a third of these individuals are children. We know that the use of good quality bike helmets can prevent brain injuries by up to 80%. And we also know, unfortunately, that in Nova Scotia, there's many families and children that just don't have access to these good quality, perhaps life-saving helmets. Since founding Lids for Kids years ago, we've had the pleasure of giving away hundreds of bike helmets to Nova Scotian families. Our mission is to put a bike helmet on the head of every child in Nova Scotia who needs one. Whether any of these bike helmets that we've given away has made a difference in terms of saving a life or preventing a serious brain injury, we'll likely never know. But look, if it makes a difference in one person's life, the initiative is entirely worth it.
It was about 4 years ago. I asked my wife if she wanted to go for a walk. We get to a crosswalk. Coming out of the sideway was a car that didn't see us. My wife was thankfully a couple feet in front of me, and she hit me, and I remember seeing her face, and that's about it. My head hit the roof of the car, and I ended up 20 feet down the street. That's all I really remember from the accident. One of my wife's friends happened to drive by, and she so let's go to the hospital. They did all the brain scans and everything on me. I had a lot of injuries, my shoulder, my knee. From there, it's just, didn't know what to really do. And a good friend of mine said, you know, you should maybe call a lawyer. They can maybe give you some advice on what to do. And I found Valence, filled out the form online, and I got a phone call from Phil, who was like incredible. It was like talking to an old friend. We chatted, I told him the whole situation, and from there, he just led me on the right path, made sure I got all the treatments I needed. They were absolutely incredible. I was happy with them right from the start. Thank you, Valent Legal.
Test. Oh. Test, test. Okay. All right. Yes, yep, they're coming. They're on their way up. Yep. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. We're at our last discussion for today. We have our lived experience panel. I'm very excited for this part. I'd like to introduce Shelley Pick. She will be our moderator for the lived experience panel, and I will pass it over from here.
So are you going to hand that to me? Yeah, I didn't want to try to do that.
That's okay. There we go.
There, can everybody hear me? I hope it's okay if we sit down and relax now, and I hope everybody can just gather to listen and to interact at some point. But we have 3 guests in this panel today, and so I'm going to let them introduce themselves. And just so you know, my name's Shelley. I'm a brain injury survivor myself, and 17 years. In fact, this morning was my 17th year anniversary of surviving. So there you go. So how appropriate. I'm at a brain conference. So what we're going to talk about today is navigating systems and resources with a sometimes invisible disability, which it is. But before we can talk about that, I thought it would be really important to hear who these 3 people were and what their experiences were. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, names, kind of their backgrounds, brain injury, and why they're sitting and have been asked to be on a panel to talk about this. So anyway, who you are, and I'm going to start off with Dan to begin with. And so we have Dan, Melinda, and Jill. So we'll start off here, and then we'll go from there. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Shelley. My name is Dan Van Voot. I had my first head injury when I was 17 years old, and it was a cycling accident. At the time, I didn't really identify, which might sound quirky, but that was the case. I mean, back then, they just kind of stitched people up, sent them home. And when you were physically healed, you were assumed to be healed in every sense of the word. I thought I was, but clearly not. I had psychological issues following that, and but for the most part, I lived a productive life. I didn't realize until 10 years ago that I lived basically my entire adult life as a head injury survivor, because I didn't really self-identify until my second injury, which took place in the spring of 2014. A lot of my head injuries, well, all of them, as a matter of fact, are related to vision loss. I I've had low vision my entire life. Uh, in fact, I've been registered with the CNIB as legally blind since the age of 5, but my vision has gotten progressively worse throughout my life. At one time, I did have sight in both eyes. Now I just have 5% in one. So in 2014, which was the head impact, which really registered with me, I walked into a wooden overhang at Halifax Shopping Center, and that basically unraveled my life. My relationships changed, my life changed, so many things changed. I wound up moving. To date, I've had altogether 12 concussions. So the biggest miracle for me, and I consider it nothing less than a modern day miracle, is that the sight in my right eye has remained. I'm not sure how it has survived all the impacts, because that was the one thing I was warned about. I was told by my ophthalmologist, whatever you do, avoid head injury. Well, I haven't done a very good job of that, clearly. But yeah, I could go on, but and there's a lot of detail behind all this, of course, but that would take a whole other session. So those are the basics, but I'll be open to more discussion and any questions you might have as this progresses.
Thank you, Dan. And that was just a small snapshot to introduce you, just the beginning, right? And so I forgot to say, because I'm a brain injury survivor, for anybody who has questions, please out there, please write them down, because we know you might forget them. So try to write them down if you can. And at further towards the end, we're going to have an opportunity to ask questions of our panelists. And as well, we're hoping that people are feeling like throughout they can write it down, but we don't want to interrupt what you're saying, sort of thing. So we're trying to work with brain injury survivors. That's all we can do. So now I'm going to turn it over to Melinda.
Hi, I'm Melinda Dollar-Thompson. I'm a brain injury survivor. In 2016, we traveled to St. John, New Brunswick to say goodbye to my mother-in-law. So on the morning of her funeral was at 11 a.m. and at 6:30 in the morning, I was taking my father-in-law's shirt down the basement stairs to iron it for the funeral. At the very top stair, my toe caught in my pajama pants, and I went and landed headfirst in a dive position on the concrete. My own doctor at home can't believe that I actually survived it. I went into the hospital, and because of some confusion about what was going on, the doctor said to me, "Oh yeah, you're great, go home and go back to work on Wednesday, you'll be fine." Famous last words. So anyways, my favorite saying is that your brain is lying to you. So when you have a brain injury, what you think is going on might not necessarily be what's going on. After several months of the room spinning all the time and sounds bothering me, the typical things that goes on with a brain injury, I went and had some tests done and realized that I really only had straight ahead vision. I had nothing at all from the sides, and that was causing issues. But in my head, I thought that my vision was fine. So, and memory issues, and I've come so far. There's been a whole list, a myriad of symptoms that some of them have been solved, some of them I've gotten around. I've always been a positive person, and I like to say, if you can't go around it, go over it, go under it, go through it. And if you can't deal with it, then you find a different way of not dealing with it. But that has helped so much through the years, and I've overcome a lot of things. I love to cook, and when I first came out of the brain injury, the initial recovery and everything, I realized I couldn't even cook a ham. I had no idea what temperature it was. I had no idea what I had to do to it. I had no memory. So I had to relearn so many different things. I was a banker, and prior to that, I did investments, and I ran my own business and things. I tried different therapies and different experts and things through my work that were paid for through my insurances and things. But I have executive dysfunction. I have a hard time getting through the day. I have one of those in-out boards like you see in your office. I have it for brushing my teeth, eating lunch, eating breakfast, taking my pills, things like that. And that helps get me through my day. And I still, on a weekly basis, am trying to find ways around difficulties that I'm having. And that is my number one thing that I would like to tell anybody that has a brain injury or a stroke survivor, that if you can just work around it, maybe you can't do it the way you did when you first had your injury, but working around things and finding a way. Where there's a will, there's a way. And like I said, sometimes there are brick walls, and the brick walls I just try to ignore.
Thank you, Melinda. And you see, it's hard to separate our stories from reaching out to all of you and giving, right? So we're just going to be okay with popcorn style. That's fine. Deep, deep stories there, and we're going to hear more. So now we're going to turn to Jill.
Thank you. Hello to everybody here in the room and who's joining us online. My name is Jill Lacey. Am I too far away? Is that better? Okay. I was just saying hello to everyone that's here in the room and people that are joining us online. My name is Jill Lacey. I'm a 2-time stroke survivor. I had my first stroke in 2018, and had a second stroke in 2023. What I can say is that everyone who's experienced stroke has had different experiences, different challenges, but we all have some things in common. And talking about those things and getting together with people who understand are really what I think is the biggest part of the healing process. And taking advantage of all the resources that are there in the community to help those of us who are recovering is fabulous. And I'm really grateful to have been asked to be part of this conference because I think it's really important.
Thank you, Jill. And we're just getting to know you a little more today, so we really appreciate that. So I guess now we turn into the kind of the meat and again, navigating systems and resources with a sometimes invisible disability. Now you're three different people. You have three very different lives and three different experiences, you know, stroke, brain injury, many other things there too. So in your experience, have you had any challenges accessing resources and our services after your stroke or brain injury? And if so, what do you think would make this process smoother for you and others accessing the same services? Have you heard that? What challenges have you had with accessing resources and or services? Who wants to go? Okay.
Following my second head injury in the spring of 2014, and I'll admit that part of this is personality too. I really isolated. You know, back then people were told, you know, stay in a dark room for however long, you know, basically stop living your life. So I did that pretty much for 4 months. But as far as knowledge, I stayed offline, and the first thing I did was I started seeking out information about concussion, and I found an article online written about that was about Eric Lindros, and thankfully that was a lifesaver because I felt like I was reading about myself, and up until then, I mean, I'll admit that following the second concussion, I was bewildered. I was having all these erratic symptoms that seemed to come out of nowhere. I didn't understand myself anymore or what I was going through, what was going on around me, basically anything. So yes, I did isolate. And what happened was a year following that impact, I started reemerging into the world again, and I attended a self-defense workshop that was held at the CNIB. And fortunately, there was a lady there who also had low vision, but she also is a head injury survivor. And she was telling me about this group, and it turned out to be the ABI day program. So I plugged into that. Not right away. It took me a year to do that too. So I just managed to get in just before the cutoff point. I guess back then, I'm not sure how things are now, but back then, if you didn't register within 2 years following a head injury, you were no longer allowed to. So I got in just before the cutoff point. So even during that intake meeting, I learned so much about myself. You know, just the questions I was being asked and the way I answered them. For one thing, I'd actually forgotten about the first impact I had when I was 17 years old. I'd completely forgotten about it. And I was saying, well, that couldn't have a bearing on the second injury, could it? And she just said, yes, it did. Yes, it would. The brain never forgets. You know, and that was both revealing and a bit more than a little shocking. So, but that also indicates that all subsequent concussions have the same cumulative effect. So, yeah. But yeah, the ABI program was definitely a turning point. I really enjoyed it. There was peer support. For the first time, I encountered a group of people who, well, basically spoke the same language I did. And For the past couple of years, I've been attending the Brain Matters peer support group, and that took that feeling of belonging, that feeling of connectedness, and even increased it even more. It was, for the first time, probably in I'd say forever, I found my people. You know, not to put any other organization down, but or single anybody else out, but I tried a lot of organizations, but I never did feel that sense of fitting in. You know, whether that be them or me or both, I'm not sure what, but yeah, this has been a good fit. So greatly appreciate it. It's like a newfound family.
Thank you, Dan. Let's just say you talked a lot about isolation, and when we were asking the question about what resources or challenges and to what is oftentimes an invisible disability, sometimes I'm wondering, does the invisibility include ourselves sometimes as we challenge with who we are anymore? So I wanted to reflect on that. So let's turn it over to Melinda.
Talking about barriers, sometimes it can just be or even our memories. With Brain Injury Nova Scotia, they had put out these little memos in little newspapers and things like that, that there was different things that we could go to. And I had gone into an appointment, and on a little bulletin board was this little cutout from one of those papers. And I took a picture of it. And every month I said, oh, I'm going to go to this. I'm going to go to this. And then it would be Tuesday, and I'd say, okay, I've forgotten. And it was just keep trying. And I ended up, I was able to go, and it's every Thursday. And I was able to go, and it's made such a difference. It's finding community, finding other people to talk to. The other barrier, and one that has happened recently, is when you have a brain injury or you're a stroke survivor and you're trying to go in for your appointments, you use up so much energy just getting there and trying to make your travel, make sure you know where you're going and getting there. And recently I had an appointment at the new Bayers Lake facility, which is a beautiful facility. You drive in, and there's this little thing with this new kind of parking that I wasn't familiar with. But the little sign didn't really tell you what you had to do to park. So I'm thinking, okay, well, I've got to take care of my parking. So I walk in the front door, and I found out since that there usually is a lot of volunteers there to help you, but that day there wasn't anyone, and it was very crowded. And all the signage is very low. So if there's a crowd of people, the signage is in front of them, so you can't see the signs. So I can't find the place to figure out my parking. So I said, well, I'm going to go and sign in. Then I couldn't figure out where I'm supposed to go and sign in. There's all these little areas for different activities. And it took me about half an hour of wandering around trying to figure out where I'm going and what I'm doing. And that's your brain space being used up, but it's also your energy. And by the time I got everything all figured out and got into my appointment, I couldn't remember why I was even there for my appointment, because it was just too much. So I have called them and let them know, it'd be great if there were some signs up above, or, just letting them know for people with vision issues, or somebody with a brain injury, that type of thing. So that kind of a barrier can be really hindering. And as I mentioned, you're trying to get there and get the best you can out of your appointment, whatever it may be. And we've gone through so many, all of us, with the brain injuries and the strokes. But it's just one of those things that you're trying to maintain that energy, and that can be a difficulty as well.
Melinda, that last one was really about navigating, literally, like that, very physically navigating. And it's so interesting how we take things for granted until. And so before, without the brain injury, you just kind of figured it out, but now it's extremely hard. So thank you for talking about that. I'm going to pass over to Jill.
Thank you. I made some notes in my phone, and of course I didn't change the setting that allows you to control how long the screen stays lit. So that's definitely a barrier. I'll start by saying that. Thank you. So I had a very different experience with accessing services between my two strokes. For the first one, I was in the hospital for the first month. And following that, went to the Nova Scotia Rehab Center for 6 weeks. So I was being shepherded the whole way through that process. Was able to access inpatient therapies, set up on my own after I was released for ongoing therapies on an outpatient basis, connected with the Acquired Brain Injury Day program. So that was, I had a familiarity with all of those things, having been through that. So when my second stroke occurred, which was a very different experience, I went to the emergency room because I knew from before that something was wrong, and had to spend a few days in the hospital waiting for an MRI. But no real services other than that. It was essentially just placeholding. Um, and then after I was released and, told quickly, what had occurred, and, I was sort of left to my own devices. I referred myself back to the doctor that had been following me at the stroke clinic, and reached out to folks who I was already familiar with because of my first experience. But those people who haven't been in the inpatient system, unless they've been connected, through their healthcare, they really don't know what's there. And other than looking online, um, I feel like that's sort of a gap right now, that I know there are some tremendous resources there, but it's connecting folks who don't know what they are with the service providers. And just since I've had my second stroke, I've kind of, become a bit of an urban legend, and people know, if you know someone who's had a stroke or a brain injury, talk to Jill. Um, I've had a couple of texts and phone calls or emails from friends, so and so I know doesn't know what to do, and I try to send them in the right direction. But I would say that's the biggest barrier, I guess, as I see it, right now for accessing resources for stroke survivors.
Yeah, that's very important too. I wonder though, we talk about brain injury and stroke being sometimes a completely or a lot of invisibility with it. And I wonder how much of that affects our ability to kind of access resources and stuff. So my question to you now is that whole idea of it being an invisible disability, can you relate to that? And if so, how?
Can very much relate to it. Well, the head injury, I find society gets absolutely no recognition whatsoever. And if I do tell people, I get this sort of glazed look, like, "What do you mean head injury?" You know, and even worse, sometimes I get a somewhat of an alarmed look, you know, as if somehow that's an indication of danger or something like that. However, I mean, the past 5 years, as my vision loss has progressed, I've been carrying a white cane. I've been wearing well, I guess this is the one indication of head injury. I've been wearing a cycling helmet to avoid head impacts. But the white cane specifically brings me a lot of attention. So yeah, the visible aspect of it definitely does help. I mean, when I started carrying a white cane, people started saying, "Dan, I didn't realize you had a vision issue." I'm thinking, of course, me being me, I say, well, only my entire life. But yeah, the white cane did make a difference and still does. But yeah, it does seem like people do really need that visual sign. And if they don't, there's almost an aspect of disbelief, you know.
And Melinda, can you identify with it being an invisible disability, and how does that impact your navigation of resources?
Through part of my journey, I had issue with facial recognition. So where I worked in a large facility with a lot of different people, and people that I worked with on a daily basis, and I could not put their face. It was almost like there was You know, you see what those movies where the face is gone and it's just kind of like a mush. It was kind of like that. So for instance, my daughter's boyfriend, his mother, I could only identify her by her haircut and her glasses. It was like it was just a little walking hairstyle and glasses going around. And if I saw that, I was okay. But if she had sunglasses or a hat on, had no idea who she was. So that was very difficult because all the people that I'd met through different parts of my life previously would walk up to me and be used to me saying, you know, talking to them and saying, how are your kids and this type of thing. And I walked past a very close friend in the mall one day, and she kind of looked at me, her kid said, there's Melinda. And she came over, and it was just, it was very difficult. And it was very hard for other people to understand because you look fine. You look, that's the biggest pet peeve of somebody with a brain injury or the stroke survivors, but you look great. But you know,
I hear that a lot.
yes, yes. And I always use the example of, I've got a beautiful car sitting in the driveway. Isn't it great? Doesn't it look great? There's no engine. It's not going to take you anywhere. So just that trying to get through the world and try to deal with people in your personal life and your business life and et cetera, and not being able to, for them to know that there's something going on, not maybe they don't know the history of what's going on and everything. It was really difficult.
I hear you, and I see people nodding everywhere about this. So Jill, I'm hearing that you can definitely relate to invisibility.
Absolutely. The first stroke was, there was a very physical, you just had to look at me and see me in a wheelchair and with a feed tube, and you knew something was going on. But with the second stroke, the experience was completely different and didn't have the same, you couldn't see it. You couldn't look at me and know what was going on inside my brain. And it's difficult because the expectation when you go places is, you know, you can manage just like anyone else, and your need for, I'm going to use a word I don't love, which is accommodations, but your need to have your challenges being addressed is often overlooked, or it's perceived kind of harshly, or you become like you're not there. It's too much trouble to, you know, make the world more accessible to you. So we'll just deal with everybody else. So it's been very difficult with the second stroke, with depression and anxiety and those kinds of things. And the reaction of others is just a small part of it, but certainly that's the thing I notice more. I think navigating my own responses and my own responsibility, I guess, for being an advocate for myself is one thing, but navigating the rest of the world is a big challenge too.
Fascinating for me, Jill, because hearing the big difference between stroke number one and stroke number two. And stroke number one, you could tell. If you looked at you, you could tell. The stroke number two, you couldn't really tell. So you really have sort of an insight into this invisibility or visibility sort of thing. And everybody can argue it'd be better if it was visible. No, it'd be better if it was invisible. And depending on what our injury is, and if it is visible, we always think the other one has it better, right? so I guess my question now is, when we heard from Ainsley today, she talked about the intersection between mental health and brain injury. And I thought it was fascinating. Thank you, Ainsley. But this word, how things intersect, right? So mental health and brain injury, what they have in common is brain health, right? And no matter what our injury is, that's what connects us. So this intersectionality, it means things affect us other than just our brain injury. And sometimes I think we don't think about that. So I'm just wondering if each one of you, if there are other things that intersect with your brain injury that maybe would give insight to people. Just like mental health and brain injury, are there things within within you. And then let's just say that's called intersectionality, right? How different things can intersect. Okay, so I'm also going to say, as someone, Brain Injury Nova Scotia, we went to the prison in Truro, and so if you're incarcerated, you're more likely to have had a brain injury. If you're a woman who has had intimate partner violence, you're more likely to have a brain injury. You know, so that's an intersection of different circumstances. So have you felt any intersectionality or other things that have intersected with your brain injury?
Yeah, for me, that's a long story. Well, first of all, just to go way, way back to day one, I was born 2.5 months premature. At one point, I was under a pound.
Wow.
So I was in an incubator for 10 weeks, and that's the origin of my eye damage. But being isolated for 10 weeks in an incubator, at that time they didn't do a lot of socialization with the babies. So no doubt that would have led to some mental health issues. It's probably why I tend to be a bit of a loner to this very day. That's how I started out in life. So um, so following the head injury, like any tendency I had towards isolation, social caution and that kind of thing, that only got exacerbated. Um, any tendency I had about fear, um, I read since that depending on what part of the brain gets impacted, like if you have a fear response to something, that gets heightened. And when Shelley was talking about intersectionality, of course, my eye issues fall into play there too. So, in other words, if I have a fear of blindness combined with the head injury, that can become outright terror, and does. So, the other thing, of course, too, when I have a visual symptom, because the optic nerve in the brain also affects vision, I have to ask myself, is it the brain or is it the eye? And I never really know which. Like at some point, at different points, I get sick of running to the eye doctor and saying, is something going on? Is something going on? So I try to hold back, but often I wind up breaking down and going anyway. I try to weather things out, but not always successfully. But in the meantime, there's a whole wave after wave after wave of stress. So I'm never quite sure, like at different times, like I said, whether it's the brain or the eye. And then of course, the head injury has its own effects. Like at times, I can get fatigued during the middle of the day, yet at the same time, I can be up at 5 a.m. wide awake. So my schedule can be all over the map. A lot of times I'm thankful that I live alone because I don't my quirks and my erratic schedules don't affect anyone else. So, that kind of thing. So I'm sure as many you can relate. We all have our own stories, and there's a lot more detail I can go into, but I think we all know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, so just a little intersection of different things happening, Dan. Yeah, especially when you think about if you're blind and brain injured, and there are many other combinations, and to think how they all affect each other, right? So, Melinda.
I'm a woman of a certain age. So, um, so menopause can be very weird experience for somebody who has a brain injury or a stroke survivor. I went to see my doctor last fall, um, and I said to him, should I be tested for early Alzheimer's because this is getting really bad? And he said, what kinds of things are happening? And it just so happened that the lady before him I knew her and we knew each other, and he just kind of said, and we had talked on the way in, and she was talking about her menopause symptoms, and she was just kind of leaving. And he said, well, have you considered that it's just menopause? And it's a very scary thing when you've got a brain injury and your memory's going even much more so. And it probably is, part of it is probably menopause. And that intersection for so many of us is a hard thing to go through anyways, but to go through it with a brain injury is also a big hurdle. and you're not sure if you're reading the symptoms right or if that's what it is. It's difficult.
Yeah, and how important is it that we do pull them apart? I don't think we can, but it's just interesting to note because I wonder how many people out there listening to you are saying, "Oh yeah, you have no idea all the stuff I have happening to me too." Jill, how about you in intersectionality?
For me, I would say stress and coping. And my response to stress and coping has really changed. I come from a career that was very high stress, one in which you're dealing with crisis every day. And productivity, I think, was my way to manage that between work and home. And that changed with since the first stroke, but particularly since the second stroke, in that it kind of tipped the balance for me. Emotions are now a big thing. I can't believe I haven't cried yet. I think I said to Melinda, make sure you bring tissues. um, Depression and anxiety are sort of the things I struggle with now. All of the stress and things is just noise, and I find I have to just focus on one thing. Everything else is a distraction. Just, if you want to get something done, one thing at a time. And it's something I still have to focus on, and it's, managing your day so you can accomplish that before you get fatigued is it's a day-to-day challenge, I would say, for sure.
It's interesting, Jill, you brought up emotional, like just crying at the drop of a hat, which is such a common thing with many of us who are brain injured. And actually can be, we have over emotions or we have no emotions, right? So we're either too high, too low, and sometimes both. So that can definitely be a barrier, right? When you go into, because some people can judge you, like if you are in an appointment and you're crying your eyes out all of a sudden, or you're flat as a nail, that can be a real thing that kind of hinders getting the proper help that you need. So you guys have done a great, how do you say, job of saying all the ways that we run into barriers. But let's kind of turn it now. You can continue to bring up barriers if you want, but what advice would you have of things that might be helpful or things you've found that have been successful in navigating those barriers or challenges? And not only for yourselves and for the people that are brain injury survivors out there, but also there are professionals listening and there are families and caregivers. So any kind of advice you have to help people navigate and get through these barriers. Anybody want to start first?
For myself, I find meditation does a world of good. And I've tried a variation of different methods. There's lots of styles that are available on YouTube, so it's easy to find. Yeah, I'm right now, I'm currently doing a meditation method that's 11 minutes. I do it twice a day, and I can't quite believe the difference it makes. It centers me. If I'm feeling high strung or fearful or anything like that, it will it will it will level that off, or at least get it to a point where I can manage it. And of course, the other thing I do is, well, the other thing that really helps is peer support. Again, I can't stress this enough. The to not isolate yourself. It's really important not to do that, even though that may feel like a natural or even desirable tendency. And yeah, solitude can be an addiction in and of itself, but try not to.
Awesome. Let's hand it over to Melinda.
I have fantastic pharmacy and a great doctor. When I first started with the head injury, my attendance at my appointments with my doctor were terrible. I would forget. I'd be like, okay, I have an appointment on Tuesday, but which week it was awful. So my doctor's office, this was pre-COVID, would call the day before, and they would say, "You have an appointment tomorrow at 10:40. Looking forward to seeing you." Just that little gift of calling me and reminding me was huge. And then all of a sudden, I'm at all my appointments. I also, little secret, I make all my appointments for 11 o'clock because I could never remember what time is my appointment. Is it morning? Is it afternoon? Do I have to get up? So I started saying, I don't care if I have to wait 3 weeks. If you can get me in 11 o'clock, I'm good. And that was just gravy. It was so wonderful. It just makes such a difference. My pharmacy, oh, I call them my girls, but there's a guy now too. They're fantastic. I was having trouble figuring out all my pills. So, and a lot of people do this. I've got them all in the little pop packets, but they call me when they're ready. And if I haven't been there for a couple of days and they're still sitting there, they'll call me again. And it's just, hey, how you doing? They have me set up so that I can do it online, and went through how I could do my orders and everything like that. This summer, unfortunately, my husband had a heart attack. We were driving out near Masstown, and the ambulance drivers asked me what conditions he had and what medications he was on. And I said, just a second, because I knew my girls had me. I called. They had a screenshot of everything and made little notes on the bottom for me before the ambulance even left the parking lot where they were picking up my husband. So just having that team, having that solidification of it, just knowing that they're behind you and doing little things like that, it's huge. It made such a difference.
There was something that Ainsley said in her presentation. I think it's the first thing I wrote down, which is that mental health care, I wrote, equals whole body care. And I thought that was really great. I'm kind of the person that if I have, 10 things to do today, looking after myself, my physical self, my nutrition, my exercise, that'll be number 11 every time. And it's not anymore. It's got to be at the top, because if I don't look after me, I can't do the other things. Unfortunately, with the with the brain injury, it also means after I've looked after me, I usually don't have any energy to do much else. But showing yourself some grace, allowing yourself, I think, the privilege of being able to do that, I think, is really important. And for me, not putting too many expectations on that, just doing it and remembering, it doesn't have to be perfect. Just do something.
Thank you. I'm just wondering, do we have any questions from the virtual people? And if not, are there any questions out here? We just have a couple of minutes before we have to go. Maybe I'll do this one then.
Thank you. I was wondering, particularly for Dan and Jill, when you went to emergency and then were released, it seems like there was kind of a gap between when you were released and when you kind of found your way into treatment, especially I'm thinking after your second stroke. And I was wondering, how would you like to see that change? Would you like to see the emergency room handle it? Would you like to be referred to your family practitioner, have them handle it? How could this be improved so that, you don't spend a year in the dark and, and you don't have to reach out to your previous physician? That referral should have gone through.
I mean, one of the things I would like to see happen is for at hospitals, for there to be a position, someone that's there, like a navigator type position, to connect folks with resources in the community, not just for stroke, but for and brain injuries, but for anything that requires ongoing support. I think that's a real gap that's missing, and there's probably something that already exists, and I don't even know what it is, and I haven't benefited from it. So That's kind of one thing, but hospitals are just a part of it. There's lots of people who I've met through the March of Dimes, for example, through some of their groups. There's people that live in rural areas who've gone to a family practitioner in their area and don't know. I think I referred someone to the ABI program who didn't know anything about it, and she lived in a rural area in Nova Scotia. And I said, look, I can't promise you that you're eligible, but talk to them, go online, see what you can find out. So I think, I don't know what the answer is for that, but I really feel like there needs to be something there to bridge that gap, so some kind of further connection for folks.
I find too that sometimes the medical system can add to confusion. For example, a few weeks ago, I had an MRI, and a couple of days later after that, I had a meeting with a neurologist. The MRI came up clean. There was no abnormalities, no sign of stroke, no bleeding, no bruising. Basically, I was told the brain was healthy. Yet that very day, I was having head throbbing, I was having brain fog, I was feeling this sense of not disorientation, but kind of this disengaged feeling. So something was going on. So anyway, the news of the MRI should have had me, doing cartwheels, but I was confused. I'm thinking to myself, okay, how can these two things coexist? So the more I thought about it, the more kind of rattled I got. It left me with something I couldn't resolve. So fortunately, later that day, at a Brain Matters session, and I started talking about it, and I didn't even realize the state I was in until I started talking about it. I didn't realize my own internal confusion. I just realized that something was weighing down on me, and I didn't even realize what it was. So anyway, in talking about it, I kind of made sense, and I got some understanding as a result. That was fed back to me. But there are so many things in the medical system, like if it doesn't show up on a test or if it doesn't show up on a scan, you're kind of left with the impression it doesn't exist. Now, fortunately, I mean, the neurologist I saw did not take on that perspective. I mean, to give credit where credit was due, he recognized that the other symptoms were present. He didn't say, he didn't shed any doubt on that, but yet he couldn't provide any real answers as to why they were there either. So
Thank you, Dan. I'm just realizing it's 4 o'clock. So I guess we have to bring this to a close. Excellent. And there wasn't any pressing questions. I think we did the best we could in the time we could. And I'd like to thank all three of you for sharing so much. Thank you.
There you are. Yes, thank you. Oh, go right ahead. This is the draw for the iPad.
Why don't you pick it? I'll hold it up.
Yeah.
We'll go just over here. Let us know when you can. Can you see us? Can you see us here? Hi, everyone. Thanks for your attendance today, and to everyone online. I know it's a long afternoon, and based on some of the feedback we got last year to cut it down to a half day. So I hope you got some value out of the sessions. My name is Patrick O'Connell. I'm the current chair for the board of directors for Brain Injury Nova Scotia. Been with the board now a couple years, all as volunteer work and as a brain injury survivor myself from about 15 years ago. I love coming to this stuff and learning and hearing and just seeing the attendance online brings me hope for the future and better outcomes for folks that are experiencing what we've all went through at one point or another. So thanks for your attendance today. We are going to start off with the draw for the iPad before we get into some final remarks. I'm going to hold up the bag. Can we get a drum roll? RJ Langevin. Congratulations. Right over here. Maybe at the next Brain Matters, we can get one of someone to help you set it up.
He said, "Oh, you're folding it that way, are you?" I said, "Square doesn't work for me."
Great, well, congratulations. Before we wrap up today, I just want to give a few thank yous to everyone that's been involved today. First and foremost, thank you to the March of Dimes. Without you and your organization, this event would not be possible. So thanks for your attendance today and all of your support. Going through the speakers today, just to touch on the last group we had, I know it takes a lot of courage to get up here and share your story. I think from an outsider looking in and hearing what you're going through, I think it provides a lot of value for folks that are either going through something similar or for people that are caregiving for someone who's going through a brain injury of that matter. So I know it takes a lot to be up here and share your personal stories, a lot of courage, so thanks for doing that. And thank you, Shelley, for moderating that. I'd also like to thank Dr. Michelle Plowman for her presentation today. Thank you very much. It was nice to get kind of the physiological and science-backed information for everyone. It's not something that we always look into, I think, in terms of our community-based servicing, but it certainly is impactful in what you're studying and researching. So thank you very much. I'd also like to give a thank you to Ainsley Fraser, kind of bringing that practicality side to what's within our control in terms of recovery and just fostering that mentality of, you know, this is going to be a bit hard, but it's challenging and there's ways to cope with that. And the better we cope with it, the better our physiological outcomes can be. So I think it was a great kind of 1-2 combo there. So thanks again for coming in and presenting. I would also like to thank Valiant Legal and the Sick Kids Foundation for sponsoring today's event. Without their sponsorship, this does cost the organization's money where we're non-for-profit. It goes a long way for our budget and putting on events like this that are at no cost to our members. So thanks to both Valiant Legal and Sick Kids Foundation for their sponsorship today. I'd also like to thank all the community partners that took the time out of their afternoon to come here today. I know there's a big presence online, as well as we have about 35 people in the room today, so that's been phenomenal. Really appreciate you taking your time. Again, we're all in this kind of together for helping people navigate, the brain injury pathways, as well as provide support. So it's great to see kind of aligned outcomes kind of coming together and hoping that we can help improve the system and people's experience as they try to navigate what life is moving forward. So thanks to everyone here today. Finally, I would like to thank the Cedar Event Center. This has been a great venue, and special shout out to Anthony, who helped us set up and donated the TV for use today. That was great. He's been a rock star. And also would like to thank Noah, our volunteer here. We had a staff resignation about 2 weeks ago, and we're scrambling to get someone to help with our audio video, and Noah stepped up. So I'd like to give a big round of applause to him. Finally, as you can see, and you'll likely receive an email later today for feedback. We did gather some great feedback after last year's event and the year before. It's crucial for us to kind of review all of that and see what we can do to make this a better experience for those folks either online or in person. So if you have a chance on your way out, please scan the QR code on the screen. That should be available online as well. And please fill out the feedback form. It'll help shape next year's event. And give us some opportunities of what went well, and what we can do better. So that's it for me. We're only 6 minutes over, so that's pretty good. And thanks very much for your attendance today. Have a great day.